Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, where it's the best place to learn about Canadian finance. Now, over last week, a number of viewers have sent me articles or comments or private messages about Canada's rising national debt. A lot of them have read articles and they're very concerned about the situation and how it will affect us, and they want me to talk a little bit about it. Now, this is also a topic that I've always wanted to talk about. It's no surprise for this year because of COVID, our country's deficit and debt have skyrocketed to a new level. Now, first of all, for this video, I'm only going to talk about the effects of having these debt. I'm not going to debate whether these debt are a good move or a bad move. Personally, I think initially what the government had in mind is absolutely correct. They have to spend money to save all the small business and people first because they're the main driving force of the economy. We have seen some countries in Asia where they chose not to save their small businesses and let them die out, and now we're seeing the aftermath of their collapsing economy. So what I really want to do here is provide a more neutral take on the situation and what is going on here and how is that going to affect us in the future. Without further ado, let's really jump into it. Alright, before we move on, as a reminder to like this video so the YouTube algorithm can push this to more Canadians so they can benefit as well. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you click the link below to join my private Facebook group where you can ask questions and get more contents in the future. Alright, so first I want to talk about how the government's financial system works and how is that related to deficits and debt. And to do this, I'm going to quote and paraphrase an article from National Post, which I will leave in link in the description below. They did a very good job on describing and explaining how the system works on a basic level. Alright, so first thing first, how does our government's budget work? Best way to think about the government system, it's kind of like a corporation where you have revenue and expense. Now for revenue, these are our income tax, GST, corporate tax, capital gain tax, or other national corporations like Canada Post. On the other hand, we have expenses, and on a federal level, they spend their money on things like employment insurance, retirement benefits, providing money for the provincial government, our healthcare, and also they will use some money to pay for the interest on our national debt. So this is why every year you're going to hear the topic about surplus or deficit. When there's a surplus, there's extra money, that's when government can use that money to further boost benefits or use that money to pay off some of our debt. When there's deficit, however, then the government will consider a couple options. Number one is to increase tax. Number two is to cut costs by taking away some benefits or cutting some federal jobs. Neither of those are popular, especially increasing tax, so most governments choose to not go for this route unless they want to risk losing the next election. So this will leave the government with a third and last choice, which is to borrow money, and that's how we create national debt. And this brings us to the next part, the actual debt itself. So why are people freaking out over our national debt? Well, the answer is they actually don't freak out over that. It's the size of our national debt in relation to other important measurements like our GDP. As long as the interest payment for the debt is sustainable, then everything is fine. It's okay to increase debt. It's when we become unsustainable that's when problems starts to happen. For example, if we look at Greece in 2008, their national debt have increased to a point where they're going to default on the debt. They can't pay it back to other countries who borrow them money. And in the face of a default, what they choose to do is to massively increase tax on its citizens to a point where most people are going to evade tax. They will risk going to jail than to actually pay the tax. And a lot of them are left homeless or without food to eat. So does that mean that is horrible and we should never do it? Well, not exactly. In fact, it makes a lot of sense for a country to borrow debt. See, up to this point, you might think a government kind of operates like a person. You have income, you have expense, you also have debt. However, there are some key points that make a government very different from an actual person. Number one is the government continues forever. They're always around, they don't retire, they don't stop. So unlike a person, they don't have different life stages. And because of that, they can consistently always borrow and spend and invest. In fact, some would argue that it makes sense for them to borrow as much as possible and delay payment as much as possible because they're always around forever anyway. And second thing is, unlike us, their cost of borrowing is extremely low. If you think right now interest rate is low and your borrowing cost is low, wait until you see the government's borrowing cost. Their cost right now is at a historically low rate of 0.6 to 0.8% on average. So that's basically almost paying nothing in terms of interest. So I'll wrap up the section by talking about how does a government borrow money. Well, they do it by not going directly to a bank and get a loan. They do it by issuing something called treasury bonds. These are basically certificates of an IOU. They're going to promise you an interest rate that they will pay you, and also they will set a maturity date in the future. When it matures, they will pay you back the principal. They're going to sell these treasury bonds in the market, and anyone, including you, me, companies, banks, or huge financial institutions can choose to buy them. So why would they buy them? That's because it's a great way for you to store money for long term, especially if the issuer are someone reliable like the Canadian government. Which will bring us to part 2. Why is this going to be an issue and how is that going to affect us? Now, due to COVID, the economy basically are back to recession, and in order to stabilize the economy, the government had to pump billions of dollars into the market by doing a lot of things, like coming up with the CRB and other benefit programs in order to help small businesses and citizens. In addition, they also have to spend a lot of money to buy up tons of Canadian mortgage bonds in the market just to keep the bank's lending fluid and keep the interest rate extremely low, just so banks and people don't run into liquidity and interest payment issues. In fact, there's something that viewers have pointed out time and time over again. The Canadian government are buying an insane amount of Canada mortgage bonds just to keep the market fluid in the time being. And this, in return, is going to directly or indirectly create a couple domino effects that you should pay attention to. Number 1 is credit rating on a federal and provincial level. Now, as you see on the chart, our debt is going to expect to balloon to 1.2 trillion by next year. Now, this is a number that scares a lot of people, but I'm going to make it very clear here. Looking at just the number doesn't really do anything. Because it's the same idea as someone telling you that they're 50k in debt. Well, the next question you will ask is, how much are you making? If you're making 30k and you're 50k in debt, yeah, then you're going to have some issues. However, if you're making 300k, then now a 50k debt is trivial, it's no longer a problem. The same concept applies here. We can't just look at the $1.2 trillion and say we're in trouble. We have to compare that to our GDP. So looking at the chart here, even after the massive borrowing and deficit, it's going to bring our percentage from 26% to 41% next year. Now, even though this is the huge increase, we're still among the lowest if we compare to other G7 countries. So right now it's still okay. However, keep in mind that the sky is not the limit. Now the same concept is going to apply to our provincial level, and this is where we start to see some problem. For example, if we look at Alberta, they're going to have a deficit of $18.5 billion this year, which is 3 times higher than what they predicted in February due to oil crashing. This is going to massively increase their debt. They're already the largest sub-national sovereign borrower in the world. Many see Alberta's borrowing to be unsustainable, especially if the oil price is going to stay this low. Now, even though the federal government are not directly responsible for the provincial level of debt, many assume that they're tied together. So at the moment, every province is still seen as a very solid place to borrow money to, and they still have very good credit rating. However, we can see that large institutions are starting to ask tough questions on future game plan of handling these debt. And if we don't see a good plan, we might be in a timeline where our credit rating is going to be changed to a lower level. Now, second effect is something called corporate zombies. Due to COVID and extremely low borrowing cost, we see that corporate debt has jumped significantly. Between January and May of this year, we have seen corporate bonds jump 22.5% to a $78.4 billion. Corporate Canada's total debt is now at $2.7 trillion, which is 118% of GDP. This makes us the 3rd highest among the G20s. Now, this is going to be a huge issue because among all these corporations, at least 25% of them do not see them surviving in the long run. And if you can check all the balance sheet, you're going to find a lot of companies are actually corporate zombies, meaning all their income is not enough to even service the debt that they borrowed. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, that's because Bank of Canada has $500 billion on its balance sheet, and this year they have started to pump money by buying corporate bonds. And if these corporations can survive, then Canadians will be the one that have to pay for the bill. Which brings me to the next point is our future tax and benefit. Now, even if COVID is fixed the next day, we're still going to go into a cascading effect, and our borrowing and debt is still going to increase in the foreseeable future. This means that eventually the government will consider the two unpopular choice, increase tax or cut spendings. I personally foresee both happening, and in fact, I think the most painful thing is not getting through the COVID right now. It's after COVID is solved and everything have calmed down. How would the government now handle the massive debt they have created to try to save the economy? I think that's when the real pain is going to start for all the countries in the world. And I'm going to provide some suggestions that you can consider for your own planning in the end of the video. Now, before that, let's talk about the next point, which is that our savings are basically ruins for many years to come. To keep the market fluid and the economy running as much as possible, the government has to keep the interest rate extremely low. So what that means is no matter if you're doing a saving account, GIC, or buying bonds, it's no longer going to give you any meaningful return. And if you factor inflation into it, you're going to end up losing money. So all in all, your money is going to worth much less real fast. Which brings me to the last part, and here are some tips you can consider. Number one is look to grow your money, but don't borrow. You can consider to seek more growth in the market to make up for such a low interest rate. However, just because borrowing cost is low, don't be tempted to borrow money to invest into the market. At the current condition and how fragile our economy is, it's really unsuitable to borrow money and invest, and can possibly render yourself further in debt by doing that. Number two is revisit your plans and investment strategies. So sit down with your banker, advisor, or whoever you're working with and really go over your plan and see if the current investment strategy is still suitable for this type of market and for your long run goals. And if it's not, it's still not too late to make a change just to increase the chance you have to bring yourself to the retirement goal you have in the future. Now, and the third and last advice is be careful of corporate bonds. So a lot of people, when they're buying bonds, they're seeing that government bonds are giving too low of a return, and they might be tempted to jump into corporate bonds because they typically give a much higher return there. However, just because the name bond is in there doesn't necessarily mean it's a much safer investment. If you go into corporate bonds, you're going to expose yourself to credit rating risk, and this is very similar to a risk in the stock market. And as we discussed already, with how much corporations are borrowing and the fact that some of them are not going to survive or service their debt, you're going to see corporate bonds deteriorate extremely fast. And if you buy in thinking it's very safe, it's going to give you a much higher yield, you might be extremely surprised, as we've seen in 2008 already. Alright, so I hope this video will give you a better sense of what's going on a national and provincial level and how you can make adaptations in your financial planning for the future. So what do you think about our debt? Is this going to be a huge problem for us? Let me know in the comment below. Now, if you like these videos, I do upload them every Tuesday, 8:30 EST. So if you want more of these contents, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe to my channel and click that bell button so you get all the notifications in the future. Alright, this is Jacky. I hope you found this interesting. I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye!